Good evening, everyone. We are Team 4, and our project is based on the recent practices in monitoring and evaluation tips measuring institutional capacity from the USAID Center for Development Information and Evaluation. This document explores some of the issues, experiences, and practices within the USAID to help the staff manage for better results. It also provides guidelines, advice, and suggestions to managers on how to plan and conduct performance and evaluation activities. Ultimately, it is a guide to measure how well an organization is doing and what changes should be made to produce better results. Our presentation will discuss the 5 main sections of the USAID document, including a discussion-oriented self-assessment, an institutional development framework toolkit, an organizational capacity assessment tool, an institutional capacity questionnaire, and an organizational capacity building monitor. The first section of this document is a discussion-oriented self-assessment, which is essentially a questionnaire that evaluates an organization using a Likert scale. Discussion questions regarding human resources, financial resource management, service delivery, external relations, organizational learning, and strategic management are ranked on a scale of 1 to 5, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. The results are used to help an organization's management team assess where there are existing strengths and weaknesses, as well as what kind of obstacles will appear in the future. Next, the Institutional Development Framework Toolkit is used to improve management and capacity within an organization at all stages of development. The framework consists of 3 parts: the Institutional Development Framework, the Framework Calculation Sheet, and the Institutional Development Profile. This toolkit provides various tasks that can be analyzed, and based on the analysis, a profile can be created that depicts the advantages and disadvantages of the organization as a whole. Based on the results, the organization can then develop plans to make improvements. The Institutional Development Framework is divided into 4 progressive stages: startup, development, expansion or consolidation, and sustainability. These 4 stages represent the growth of an organization and how it progresses over time. It also divides the organization's resources into 5 different categories: oversight and vision, management resources, human resources, financial resources, and external resources. Within each of the 5 categories, there are also subcategories. For example, oversight and vision consists of the board, the mission, and the autonomy. For each subcategory, there are 3 different scenarios that the company uses to evaluate where they stand in terms of development. The second part of the Institutional Development Framework Toolkit is the calculation sheet. The calculation sheet separates the resources into 5 different sections. An initial score is to be inputted in the baseline score section, and when the organization is assessed a second time, a score is to be inputted in the follow-up score section. The average baseline and follow-up score for each of the 5 main sections is then calculated. A comment section is also provided so that notes can be taken during the assessment. The Institutional Development Profile is the final part of the Institutional Development Framework Toolkit. This is one section of a graph which illustrates the baseline score, which is in light gray, and the follow-up score, which is in dark gray, for each resource within a fictional organization. The organization's resources have the potential to increase, but they can also decrease or remain the same over time. The ultimate goal is for the resources to reach sustainability. If they have not, by the time the second score is assessed, it is evident that there is need for improvement. An organization can use the results of the IDF profile to make the necessary changes to improve in certain areas. The Organizational Capacity Assessment Tool, or OCAT, is a means of turning qualitative data into quantitative data. which is capable of numerical measure and evaluation. Because there is an objective interview process, the OCAT is a consulting and measurement tool to identify areas of needed improvement, as well as areas where success should be maintained. The OCAT is broken up into 6 steps. Number 1, determine what needs to be assessed, meaning that the OCAT can be used to evaluate smaller portions of the company as well as the whole organization. Number 2, choose appropriate questions to elicit the information needed to administer the assessment. Number 3, collect the information by means of interviews. 4, transcribe the information onto the OCAT assessment sheet. 5, transfer scores for each element used on the OCAT rating sheet. 6, calculate a score for each element used on the OCAT assessment sheet. Overall, understanding the basic structure is the most difficult aspect of the OCAT, because from there, the OCAT is then broken up into 7 components, which include governance, management practices, human resources, financial resources, service delivery, external relations, and sustainability. Afterwards, the OCAT is broken up into 36 categories with over 60 elements. First, there is the data collection process, which includes systematic interviewing. The Organizational Capacity Assessment Tool offers 7 pages of interviewing sample questions and over 20 tips so that you, the assessor, can collect all necessary and relevant information needed. Some examples of tips within the document include being objective and explaining your evaluation goals. Some sample interview questions include asking for information on the governance of the organization or the board. For example, an assessor could ask if the members of the organization's board represent the diverse interests of its stakeholders. Because the raw data is generated from primary sources, it then goes through considerable transformations. This is accounted for in the document's procedural outline, which turns the raw data into a more consistent, measurable form of qualitative data. As questions are asked and raw data is collected, the assessor works through the actual OCAT, as can be seen in this figure. Through the enormous amounts of data collected from such thorough questioning, theoretically, the assessor would have the means to be fully objective in their analysis. As these evaluations are made, the OCAT begins to yield statements about the subject organization. Remember, at this point in the evaluation, data remains qualitative or non-numerical and would be difficult to report or measure. As the breadth of the organizational statements grow and are found true about the organization, the assessor is able to determine the degree of nascence, emergence, expansion, or maturity of an organization. These are the stages of organizational development. Consider the governance section, as can be seen in the figure on the screen. Nascent organizations are in the earliest stages of development. All the components measured by the OCAT are in rudimentary form or non-existent. Emerging organizations are developing some capacity. Structures for governance, management practices, human resources, financial resources, and service delivery are in place and functioning. Expanding organizations have a track record of achievement. Its work is recognized by its constituency, the government, the private business sector, and other organizations active in the same sector. And finally, mature organizations are fully functioning and sustainable, with a diversified resource base and partnership relationships with national and international networks. This process is completed for the desired areas of assessment, but it is available for all 7 components, subcategories, and further elements. The subject organization may have overlapping characteristics, but this is not lost in the evaluation. This is used for the assessor's assistance in the assessment sheet portion of the OCAT, which we will discuss on the next slide. Utilizing the organizational statements yielded by the OCAT, which is derived from the interviews the evaluators complete on the OCAT assessment sheet, takes the qualitative statements and processes them into quantitative data. Assessment team members can darken the circle of the agreed-upon rating, which ranged from 0 or not applicable to 6 or acceptable. In cross-referencing the data collected and data yielded, a rating is generated. Once again, by considering the evaluation statements from A to F for the governance section, we can apply the ratings to each letter based on the organization. Again, the OCAT can be applied to an organization in its entirety or applied in a more limited scope. Scores are averaged and distributed appropriately through a technique called rolling up, which allows three major benefits. First, it allows for the organization and assessment team to observe and almost immediately identify where the strengths and weaknesses in the organization's capacity lie. It also allows for individual elements to be studied further to get to the source of the weaknesses, so that the corrective measures can be implemented. Finally, it allows for a comparison of an organization to itself over time, as separate assessments are carried out. The averaging technique is described in the right uppermost figure. Basically, components are averaged by their respective categories, and categories are averaged by their respective elements. The found numerical values still correlate to the stages of organizational development and can be seen in the right lower figure. The assessment team then represents this data, and an example of this can be seen on the left. It is at this point the qualitative categorical data has become measurable and can be manipulated if necessary. This will transition us into the final phase of the Organizational Capacity Assessment tool, reporting the OCAT. The assessment team will generate a document that will reinforce the findings of the OCAT, which can be seen in the figure on the left. The procedural reporting structure allows for the OCAT to be consistent and universal for inter- and intra-organizational applications. Numerical values are translated into bars. As described in the right-hand figure, greater attention needs to be paid to the lower bars of the organization. These categories, components, and elements have and will remain consistent. The significance of these bars can be seen in the measurement and application process described on the next slide. The final representation of this data can be seen in the figure on the left. Averages are applied to the categories and components, but will be taken into account in the figure on the right, where the average of the entirety of categories is calculated to represent the 7 components previously stated. The OCAT does not specify to report the averages and representations of categories. However, it would be simple to report those findings and would serve as an expanded version of the right-hand figure. The three-dimensional stratified graph pictured on the screen represents the 4 organizational capacity assessments. Remember, this is why the data is reported in the form of bars. As can be seen, the OCAT can be utilized for both immediate and long-term initiatives. For our group, this final representation of such culminated data can reflect advocates and their influence on an organization's capacity. If initiatives are implemented that negatively affect the company, due to the depth of the OCAT, an advocate's ideas become much easier to identify. Due to the circumstances and guidelines of the Organizational Capacity Assessment tool, along with such in-depth interviewing and data collection means, we have found that the OCAT can be used both internally by an organization as well as by a third-party evaluation. Because there is still an interpretation by the assessor, it is important to remember that this is a team process. However, and as the OCAT and most organizational capacity assessments demonstrate, the test is most credible when an objective third party is conducting the analysis to eliminate self-bias by the organization. The 5th section of the USAID document is an institutional capacity questionnaire that is a more objective questionnaire than the self-assessment mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. Ultimately, this questionnaire could be used by an outside consultant to rank the institution across 6 categories. That is, management, management information, staff, care quality, communications, and infrastructure. Once again, these answers can be used to assess the organization's strengths and weaknesses and can allow management to make changes accordingly. The last practice outlined is the Organization Capacity Building Monitor. This specific model was developed by Asian partners of the Christian Reformed World Relief Committee and is ultimately connected to the organizational capacity definition in general, which is provided on the slide. This technique is used to outline obstacles an organization can expect while developing. Specifically to the U.S. aid, it is used for an organization that is developing internationally and is broken up into 9 parts. The first is board or legal identity, which states that the roles of your board must always be specifically outlined. Next are your organization's vision, mission, and strategies, which advises that these 3 parts must be universally shared by everyone in your organization. Third is human resources, which states that your HR department works hand in hand with your vision, mission, and strategy. Fourth are your management systems, which advises that specific policies should be used to manage a work environment that is implementing the shared vision of the organization. Next is leadership, which simply states that your leadership must be competent and motivated to do what is best for the institution. The 6th part, networking, suggests that you network with those who provide resources for your vision. Next, stewardship states that you must responsibly manage all of your resources. Finally, we have gender participation, which advises that gender equality should be present in all aspects of the organization. And lastly, financial sustainability suggests that the financial system use all resources available to the organization. After reviewing the 5 different techniques of measuring institutional capacity, we wanted to find a way to implement this at Chapman. An idea came up which would be using the Institutional Development Framework Toolkit to create a more comprehensive course review at the end of the semester. This would give Chapman better insight into what they need to improve upon for each course. Oversight and Vision would evaluate the design of the course, Management would evaluate your professor, Human Resources would be a student's honest opinion as to how much the students are understanding the material, the Financial Resources section would evaluate the textbook and how it was implemented, and finally, the external resources can be used to see how adequate on-campus tutors are for the course, as well as how useful office hours have been throughout the semester. In addition to relating the document to Chapman as an institution, we can also relate measuring institutional capacity to our textbook, Organizational Communication, Approaches and Processes by Catherine Miller. In Chapter 4 of the text, called Methods for Studying Organizational Systems, Miller discusses the idea of a systems metaphor when it comes to organizations. With this approach, organizations can be best understood as organisms that must interact with the environment in order to survive. At its most basic level, a system is an assemblage of parts or components that make up a whole. This document separates an organization into these components such as human resources, management, financial resources, and external relations. This way, management can fix problems within each section in order to benefit the organization as a whole. We can also relate the document to Miller's case analysis research techniques, which are discussed later on in Chapter 4. In addition to a network analysis and modeling techniques as research techniques used by system researchers, Miller talks about the idea of a case analysis approach to identify an organization's strengths and weaknesses. These are done through observations, interviews, questionnaires, and archives, which are all present in the U.S. aid document. By understanding why an organizational system develops and behaves, we can also help the organization succeed. As stated by Dr. Kee, organizational communication as a field of study analyzes how the actions of people inside and outside organizations are coordinated and managed to achieve some collective outcomes. In conclusion, organizational communication is the process of determining how internal and external elements work together to accomplish a specific goal. It is important to know how to measure organizational capacity because it allows you to assess an organization and conclude where improvement is needed. The methods for measuring organizational capacity can be used for any type of organization. So no matter what path you take, having an understanding of how an organization functions allows for you to implement changes and guide an organization toward success.